The desert sun blazed mercilessly over the endless horizon, a cruel overseer casting its golden fire across the barren land where dust devils danced, and the wind carried with it the whispers of sorrow, of pain, of a land soaked in forgotten blood and broken promises. And it was along this lonely trail that Caleb McGraw, a rancher hardened by solitude and tempered by grief, rode his tired mare with only the steady rhythm of hooves and the creak of worn leather saddle for company, his eyes squinting against the glare, his thoughts heavy as the sky that seemed to weigh down upon the earth. And though many men would avoid these forsaken lands for fear of bandits, wild Apache raids, or simply the suffocating silence, Caleb had grown accustomed to emptiness, for he had lived with it since the day fever carried off his wife and child 3 winters past, leaving his heart hollow, his ranch quiet, and his spirit cracked like the dry ground beneath him. Yet he rode because a man must keep moving lest the ghosts catch him in stillness, and so he pressed on through the desert until something unusual broke the monotony of the wide plain, something that caught his weathered eyes and stirred a warning in his gut. A solitary tree standing stark against the emptiness, its twisted branches clawing at the sky as though begging for mercy. And beneath those branches hung a sight that made his blood run cold and his hand tighten instinctively on the reins. For there she was, a girl, young, Apache by her dress and braids, dangling by her bound wrists from a rough-hewn branch, her small body swaying in the hot wind, her head bowed, her legs tied at the ankles, and beside her, nailed into the cracked bark of that tortured tree, was a sign scrawled in black paint, its letters dripping with fresh red stain as though written in blood. "White man don't forgive." And Caleb felt the weight of the words as much as he did the image. For it was not just cruelty but a message, a declaration of hate and vengeance left for anyone passing by. Perhaps as a warning, perhaps as a cruel joke of fate, and for a moment he froze, staring at her frail form, unsure if she was still alive or already gone, until he noticed the faintest rise and fall of her chest, the shallow gasp of breath struggling against the ropes cutting into her wrists, and his heart, though hardened, flinched with something long buried, a flicker of compassion, a memory of his little girl who once had dark braids and soft brown eyes. And before he knew it, he had spurred his horse forward, dismounted with urgency and pulled his knife from his belt, cutting through the rough hemp that held her wrists aloft, until she collapsed, limply into his arms, her body weak, her skin sun-scorched, her lips cracked and dry as parchment, yet alive, fragile, trembling, and Caleb laid her down gently in the shade of the tree, pressing his canteen to her mouth, letting the water drip slowly over her lips until she coughed, sputtered, and then swallowed greedily, her eyes fluttering open to reveal a deep, wary brown gaze filled with pain, suspicion, and the fierce spark of a spirit that had not yet been broken. And she whispered something in Apache tongue that Caleb could not understand but felt in his bones, carried both fear and defiance, and he hushed her softly, telling her in his low drawl that she was safe now, though he knew she had no reason to trust him. A white man, when the world around them screamed with signs that forgiveness was not given, yet his hands worked carefully, untying her ankles, checking her bruised wrists, giving her water again, until at last she found enough strength to sit up, though her eyes darted around the desert like a wild creature cornered, ready to flee or fight. And Caleb, though awkward with words, said gently that he meant her no harm, that she needed shelter, that the desert would finish what the men who left her here started if she stayed. And still she stared at him with a mixture of fear and anger, and he saw in her eyes a story not yet spoken, of capture, of betrayal, of cruelty meted out in the name of race and vengeance. And he realized that whatever war or feud had led her here, she was but a girl caught in its cruel snare, and he could no more ride away and leave her than he could have abandoned his own daughter years ago. So he gathered her up light as a shadow in his arms, set her gently upon his horse, mounted behind her to steady her weak frame, and turned back toward his ranch, the lonely patch of earth he called home, though even as he rode he felt the chill of being watched, of unseen eyes tracking them from afar, and he wondered if taking her down from that tree had not just saved her life but sealed his own fate. For men who left such a message were not the forgiving kind, and in the desert nothing stayed hidden for long. Yet as he looked at her slumped against him, her braids falling loose, her breath shallow but steady, he felt something stir, something he had not felt since his family was torn from him. A reason, however fragile, to care, to protect, to fight once more against the emptiness that had nearly consumed him. And though he could not say what lay ahead, he knew the desert had just bound his destiny to that of the Apache girl, and neither of their lives would ever be the same again. So he rode on into the fiery sunset, carrying not just a stranger, but the first fragile spark of hope he had felt in years, a spark that could either save or destroy them both, depending on whether the world around them could ever learn to forgive. The ride back to Caleb McGraw's ranch was slow and grueling, the sun dragging itself across the sky as though reluctant to surrender to the horizon, and every step of the weary mare seemed heavier, with the burden not just of two riders, but of the uncertainty that clung to them like desert dust. For the girl, fragile and faint though she was, clutched at consciousness in broken waves, drifting between fevered murmurs in her tongue and uneasy silence, and Caleb felt the weight of each shallow breath against his chest as though her survival was now tied directly to his will. And when at last the familiar silhouette of his ranch rose against the dying light, fences leaning, barns sagging, fields long untended, he felt both relief and dread. Relief that shelter and water were near, dread that he had brought into his solitary world a storm he did not yet understand. For men who left her hanging beneath a hateful sign would not let go of vengeance so easily, and their shadows could already be stretching toward him even as he lowered her gently from the saddle, carried her into the dim warmth of his cabin, and laid her upon the cot where once his daughter had slept. Memories clawing at him with every motion, memories he shoved back as he fetched water, cleaned her wounds, and coaxed life back into her trembling form, whispering words she could not understand yet seemed to hear in the tone of his voice, words that carried something he had long buried: kindness, patience, a need to protect, until at last her eyes opened fully, clearer this time though ringed with exhaustion, and she studied him in silence, mistrust flickering across her face like firelight dancing in the dark. But there was also something else, a quiet question, a fragile wonder why this man, whose kind had left her strung upon that tree, now worked so desperately to keep her alive. And though she spoke no English and he no Apache, the language of need, of shared humanity, bridged the gulf between them as he pressed water to her lips, offered her morsels of bread softened in broth, and sat beside her until sleep claimed her. Not the desperate collapse of exhaustion, but the steadier rhythm of a body beginning to heal, and Caleb, watching her, knew sleep would not come so easy for him, for the night was thick with the weight of decisions. He could turn her loose. Once she was strong enough, let her find her people again if they still lived, or he could keep her here a while. Though what right did he have, a lonely rancher clinging to ghosts, to bind the fate of a girl who had already suffered so much? Yet his heart whispered another truth, that perhaps she was not sent to him by chance but by some unseen hand, for in saving her he had felt something stir in his soul, something that had been dead for years, and it frightened him more than the thought of men, with guns riding under cover of night. Yet even as he wrestled with these thoughts, the ranch's silence broke with the faint echo of hooves far off in the desert, a sound carried on the wind that froze him where he sat. For he knew the rhythm of riders when he heard it, knew the weight of a posse searching for blood, and though the sound soon faded, leaving the night once more to the crickets and the sigh of dry wind, Caleb's instincts warned him that what he had done would not remain hidden, that men who left hateful signs did not forgive and would not forget. And so the following days were spent in both care and preparation, tending to the girl who grew stronger by the hour, her wary eyes softening with each kindness, her trust given in small precious fragments, even as Caleb oiled his rifle, patched his fences, and walked the land with the unease of a man waiting for a storm. And in those days the cabin, that had been nothing but a tomb of memories, began to stir with life again, the girl moving quietly through it, her braids falling loose, her hands helping with small tasks once strength returned, fetching water, grinding corn, sweeping dust from corners long ignored, and Caleb found himself caught between the ache of memory and the fragile hope of something new, though he dared not name it, dared not imagine what the future could hold, for the desert had a way of tearing hope to shreds, and sure enough the storm came. 3 riders cresting the ridge one dusk, their silhouettes dark against the fire-streaked sky, their laughter carrying, cruel and sharp across the wind as they approached with the arrogance of men who believed the land belonged to them. And Caleb stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, the girl watching from within, her breath quickening for she recognized them, the ones who had strung her to die beneath that tree. Their eyes cold, their smirks dripping with malice as they hailed Caleb, asking in mocking tones if he had seen a little squaw hanging about, saying they had left her to teach a lesson about what forgiveness meant in this land, and Caleb's jaw tightened, his thumb brushing the trigger of his rifle as he answered, flatly, that he had seen nothing but the wind and the sand, and for a moment the silence between them was thick with threat, until one of the riders sneered, spat into the dust, and warned Caleb that the desert remembers, that white men don't forgive and neither do they, before turning his horse and riding off with the others, leaving only dust in their wake. Yet Caleb knew they would return, that this was only a taste of what was to come, and as he stepped back into the cabin, the girl's eyes locked onto his, filled with fear but also resolve, and in that silent exchange, Caleb understood that their lives were now bound by a choice neither of them had made, a choice carved into the bark of a lonely tree in the desert, and as the night fell heavy and the coyotes cried at the edges of the dark, he knew there would be no turning back, that he must stand not just for himself but for the girl fate had placed in his care, and so the lonely rancher, who had once buried his heart, now found himself preparing for war, a war not of nations or armies but of survival, redemption, and the fragile hope that forgiveness, though denied by men, might still be found. In the bond between two souls who had every reason to hate yet chose instead to endure side by side, and as the fire crackled and the girl finally slept with a measure of peace upon her face, Caleb whispered to the night that he would not fail her. Not this time, not again, for some ghosts are laid to rest only when a man chooses to fight for the living, and in that vow was the beginning of a story that the desert itself would one day remember.